So hello everybody, and welcome back to the next session of the conference. Apologies that we are running a little bit late. We've unfortunately just had a few issues with some of the translation for Diana, who's going to be one of the speakers today. So basically, we're going to move forward. Hopefully, we're going to sort those issues out. So Diana was going to speak first. We're actually going to move her to speaking last in the session, and hopefully, we'll have those issues sorted out in the meantime. So apologies for that, and apologies we're a little bit late, but we'll hopefully get all that sorted out. So we're now moving on to look at another key band in the mid-band range, and that's the C band. And once again, we have a fantastic panel of speakers with us. So without further ado, I'm going to now welcome to the stage our moderator for this session. That's Richard Womersley from LS Telecom. Richard, welcome. I know you're going to say a few words to introduce the topics and then introduce our speakers. So looking forward to the session, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good morning, everybody, or maybe good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. So our panel session this afternoon is all about C-band, and you probably heard Richard Marston say earlier in the day that he'd got a fight between the red and the blue corner, and his was the fight of the day. Well, I think his is the fight of tomorrow. And in fact, C-band is probably the fight that's still going on today and hasn't finished yet. So just a couple of slides to set the scene. Let's have the next one, please. First of all, C-band is used, 3.4 to 4.2 gigahertz is used for satellite services. And it's particularly important in countries where you have the highest rainfall. And if you look at the map, which shows rainfall across the globe, we notice that Latin America does in fact have areas with very high rainfall, with some of the highest rainfalls in the world. So clearly, satellite in C-band is an important resource for people living in those rainy parts of the world. If I could have the next slide, please. At the same time, we have a number of footnotes within the ITU radio regulations that allow the use of the very same frequency band for IMT and for mobile services. And as far as IMT goes, the whole region has 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz. But I've highlighted here those that have even more than that. So in red, you have countries who in the ITU radio regulations have access to 3.3 to 3.6 gigahertz. So that's 300 megahertz of spectrum already identified. And in orange, we have countries that have 3.3 to 3.7 gigahertz. So 400 megahertz identified for IMT. Next slide, please, which is in fact the last one. So the question is, we have a decision to make. We have to turn the dial somewhere between mobile and satellite. We could, of course, make it 100% mobile, and that would keep a number of people happy. We could make it 100% satellite. The reality is we probably have to find somewhere on that dial which is in between the two extremes. So a couple of questions to get us going. We have the question of, can you set the dial to different values in neighboring countries, and what do you do along the border? But perhaps more importantly, how do we divide the two sides? Is it guard bands? Is it some kind of geographical separation between the services? Do we need to fit filters? And how do we take that decision? Is it a political decision? Is it an economic decision? Is it a purely technical decision? Is it a legal decision? How do we decide where to set the dial? So that's, I think, the question ahead of us in this session today. And I'd like to begin by handing over to the first of our speakers today, which is Rima Hafez, who's the Director of Space Services at ISED in Canada, who's going to talk us about what's happening in Canada in C-band and the current status. And I know, Rima, you can't say too much because it's an ongoing process, but we're very much looking forward to hearing what you can tell us.
Thank you, Richard. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So I see the slides up now. So I'm going to present on the situation in Canada right now. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this shows you what our current band plan is. So basically from 3450 to 3650 megahertz. We have our spectrum, our auction coming up in June 2021 to release that for flexible use. And then from 3650 to 3700, we have what's called wireless broadband service, which I will explain in the next slide. And then from 3700 to 4200, we currently have fixed satellite service as well as fixed service. So at the end of August of this year, we released a consultation paper basically on the technical and policy framework for the 3650 to 4200 megahertz band. So looking to repurpose part of that for flexible use and transition the fixed satellite service. So I'll talk about the specific proposals there in a bit. We have the first set of comments were due October 26th, and we just received those recently. And then we will be awaiting what's called reply comments for us, where stakeholders can comment on the comments received, and that would be end of November, so coming up in a few weeks. Next slide, please. So I mentioned 3650 to 3700, we have wireless broadband service, which is basically shared access, fixed and mobile, and on an all-com, all-serve basis. So users will get the same spectrum in the same area, but they have to coordinate amongst each other. So it's mostly wireless internet service providers, through some local municipalities and government agencies, as well as utility and energy companies using this spectrum as well. So we have over 320 licensees. Next slide, please. Okay, so from 3700 to 4200, I mentioned fixed service as well as FSS. Fixed service, there's not very much use, but you can see the majority there is fixed satellite service. So we have, in terms of licensed use, over 500 licensed stations, and you can see those in blue. And then in terms of license exempt, we requested information to try to get more on those, and we received over 2,500 stations receive only there. You can see them in the pink color. So, you know, uses for these FSS stations include connectivity for satellite-dependent communities, enterprise connectivity, as well as broadcast distribution, including foreign broadcasts. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of our consultation, this slide summarizes what we've proposed in it. Basically to repurpose 330 megahertz from 3650 to 4000 for flexible use, fixed and mobile. And that includes a 20 megahertz guard band just from 3980 to 4000. We also propose to transition the FSS from the lower part up to 4000 to 4200 by December 2023. And then we would also propose to displace the WBS from 3650 to 3700 up. And that would be done in 2023 for urban as well as 2025 for rural. So we would also propose to designate 80 megahertz from 3980 to 3900 to 3980 for shared use. So you can see the figure on the bottom of the slide gives you the proposed new band plan. Next slide, please. So we also received an alternate proposal from Telesat, which we've included in the consultation. Essentially, you know, the same sort of repurposing, but instead of 3700 to 4000, it's 3700 to 4100, and it would be cleared in two phases. So 37 to 39 by 2021, and then 3900 to 4100 by 2025. So you can see there on the bottom that Telesat's proposed band plan. Okay, next slide, please. So we've requested additional information as we did in the past. We originally requested information from license exempt users, and this time around we're seeking to understand some station data for licensed FSS Earth stations, as well as the license exempt. I mentioned we got 2,500. We're hoping to see if there are more out there, as well as getting more information on the license exempt use. And then we're also, for WBS, looking for some site-specific data there. So all of that would be to help inform us towards a decision on the band. So that we're requesting that information by the end of November. So that is also coming up. Next slide, please. All right, so we mentioned the deadline for the set of comments was October 26th. We received 50 comments from respondents. So you can see the makeup there. We got, a lot of wireless providers comments. We got 6 comments from satellite operators and service providers. And then the rest, you can see government, manufacturers, so mixed comments received. And we will be waiting in a few weeks the reply comments. And once they are received, we'll be looking at those and considering the various comments and working towards making a decision on the band. So that's all I have. Again, given that it's an open process, there's not much more we can say until we await the, final comments, and then we prepare for a decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima. I mean, it may be a closed process, but I think you've still shared some very useful information that will be, interesting, and we'll see how other countries have dealt with the situation as well. I won't take questions for now. We'll move on through the speakers, I think. And our next speaker this morning or afternoon is Chris Woolford, who's the Director of International Spectrum Policy at Ofcom in the UK. And Chris is going to talk us through a little bit about what's happening within C-band across, firstly in Europe, but then specifically in the UK and the sharing situation. And a little bit like Rima, there are things Chris can't talk about as well, because there's an upcoming auction in the UK. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Richard. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. What I was going to do is, as I say, talk a little bit about what we're doing in the UK in terms of making spectrum available, and obviously particularly focus on C-band. So if we go to the next slide, our aim in the UK within Ofcom is to make sure that spectrum is being made available so that people and businesses have connectivity when and where they need it. And I think this recognises that actually we've always been in the business of making spectrum available within Ofcom, but actually we've become more aware over recent years of the need of trying to think about how we make that spectrum available. It's not just a question of getting it out into the market, it's a question of getting it out in the most appropriate way, so it's most usable by businesses, by organisations, by citizens. So if we go to the next slide, as I say, we've really thought about the different mechanisms that we have to make spectrum available, and we've engaged quite closely with those businesses, organisations, to try and understand exactly what their needs are, and particularly some of the business needs. And in terms of how we actually do that, we still make spectrum available through licenses, particularly through national licenses. This can be first come, first served, or if there's excess demand, we use spectrum auctions. And that's a very important part of our regulatory toolkit. We're actually, as Rich just mentioned, planning for an auction early next year. We also have license exemption. And that, again, is something which is really, really important. License exemption is a really good way, in particular, to promote innovation. It's easy access, low barriers to entry for those that wish to get access to spectrum. We've just made 500 megahertz of spectrum available in the lower 6 gigahertz band, for example. But we're also looking at alternative approaches and trying to sort of diversify and think about spectrum sharing. And one aspect of this is around local access licenses. And we've just identified 4 bands as of last year in the UK that we've made available for shared access for local licenses. And that includes the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz band. So I'll just talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. If we go to the next slide. I mean, what this means in terms of 3.4 to 4.2 in the UK is that we've cleared 400 megahertz of spectrum, or near enough 400 megahertz from 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz. So that is available on a cleared basis. Much of that is already out there in the market in the hands of the mobile operators. The remaining 120 megahertz we will be auctioning early next year. And that is in common with many other European countries. A number of European countries are able to clear that spectrum between 3.4 and 3.8 and are making it available generally through national licenses for wireless broadband. Above 3.8, between 3.8 and 4.2, we've made spectrum available on a shared basis. And this is very much sharing with the incumbent users in the band. So that's with fixed links, it's with satellite earth stations. And we've made, in addition to that, as I say, we think that these shared licenses can coexist with those incumbent users. So it's a very different model in 3.8 to 4.2 compared to 3.4 to 3.8. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about how that's actually worked, how those shared licenses work. And this is the top half of this slide. And essentially, we've identified these 4 bands, which includes 3.8 to 4.2. And anyone interested can apply to Ofcom for a local license. And there are 2 types of license. One is a local area license, around about a 50-meter radius, low power, and we will make it available on that localized basis. And then we also have a slightly higher power, sort of medium power license, which is available on a per base station basis. So we will get applications in. We would assess those applications, looking at interference with both the incumbent users in the band and potentially with any other local access applications that we've got. And if we think that's okay and that works, we will then issue the license. There is a license fee, but that's relatively low. I mean, we're talking in the region of sort of hundreds of dollars for a license fee, and then we would grant the license. The final thing I was just going to mention, which is something that's slightly different, but I know has generated some interest, was another part of the spectrum sharing framework. And we've also said that we will look at making bands that have been made available to the mobile operators. So this is licensed mobile spectrum available where that spectrum isn't being used by the mobile operator. So this is typically in rural areas. We know that these are national licenses, but that doesn't mean that each mobile operator uses all of their spectrum in every location. And in particular, in rural areas, we believe there is scope to reutilize some of that spectrum. And we've had some interest from communities that would like to have their own local connectivity or businesses in those areas. But they find it difficult to deal with the mobile operator. And that's not a criticism of the mobile operator. It's just that that's not the business they're in. So what we've said is that rather than go to the mobile operator, if they think if there isn't connectivity at the moment, but they'd like there to be some, they can come to Ofcom, and we on their behalf would approach the mobile operator. We'll find out if they're planning to roll out in that area. If they are, then great, there'll be connectivity. If they're not, then we can make that spectrum available to that local entity for a 3-year period. And again, there's a sort of relatively small license fee in respect of that, around about £950 in that case. But the point of this really is I'm just trying to highlight, I think, some of the ways in which we're thinking innovatively and creatively to try and think about how we can make spectrum available so that it really does meet the needs of all the different types of user that are out there that require connectivity for whatever their particular need are. And I think that the example we have in C-band is hopefully a good indication of some of those different approaches that we're taking. I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Another interesting approach, and the idea that we can share spectrum and also make it available to private individuals and private organizations, I think is an interesting one. I'm sure we'll pick up on that as we go through the session today. So thank you very much, Chris. Our next speaker will take a slightly different view. We've heard from 2 regulators, and it's the turn now of one of the users of the C-band in the form of the satellite operators. And our next speaker is Hazem Moakit, who is the Vice President of Spectrum Strategy at Telesat. and he's going to give us a bit of a global perspective on C-band, and then look at some of the lessons that have been learnt in the US in the process that's been used to clear some of the C-band. So Haz, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are. Thank you for giving me the time to share the point of views of the satellite industry here in this venue. If we can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So this sort of gives you a situational awareness about the current C-band allocation around the world, starting with region 2, at an ITU level, and then CEPT in comparison, the US, Canada, Brazil, and Mexico. This sort of tells you, where things are globally, but what really stands out, the point that I would like to make here, is that if you look in the US, because of the current C-band order there, that they wanted to clear C-band up to 4 gigahertz, if you notice that the bottom 3.4 to 3.7 gigahertz of the spectrum, the C-band spectrum, is heavily encumbered by government use, and this sort of shifted that yellow box to the right, and that's kind of put it out of alignment with the rest of the world. So we'll talk more about this if we can just go on to the next slide, please. So this sort of gives you a global view of how C-band is being used right now from a satellite perspective. And the clear distinction here is that when you see there are areas that use C-band for B2C and B2B, those are the areas in green, and some countries or some regions that rely on C-band for strictly B2B. And this distinction is clear because it defines how the regulator can look at moving on C-band, whether it's feasible or not feasible. So, and this in many ways, if we can just go on to the next slide. Actually, let's hold on. If we can go back. The key thing here that I would like to highlight is that in South America, the nature of usage right now is that there is such heavy use for media distribution. There are literally tens of thousands of IRDs, of receivers, that are downlinking linear TV programming in South America and Latin America and retransmitting them through cable systems. So there is certainly very heavy usage of C-band in Latin America. Additionally, there is a lot of B2C. There's a lot of consumer C-band dishes that are on top of roofs like in Brazil, where C-band is not only used by B2B, but also by B2C. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So if we ask the question, well, why did the needle move in the US all the way to 4 gigahertz? What were the conditions that prompted that? So the first point is the spectrum allocation and the spectrum use. So as I highlighted before, because extended C-band, the 3.4 to 3.7, was heavily encumbered by government use, the push was to move up into the conventional C-band where satellite is being used. The second point is the technology. So finally, 5G technology is here and is ready to deploy. So we reached kind of the critical moment in that. There's also the video compression technology that allows us to compress video on the satellite and consume less spectrum. The third element is the regulatory framework. I think the FCC did a great job in creating a regulatory framework that was conducive for collaboration and recognize also the rights of the incumbents. And then the fourth point is that I think the industry has reached a certain level of maturity there where there was collaboration. There was a high level of collaboration between the satellite industry and the mobile industry in the US because the right conditions existed. And then this is how we reach at an amicable solution for both sides. You can go on to the next slide, please. So even with that, the transition, the clearing of 300 megahertz of conventional C-band in the US is a very immense task. And I speak here for Intelsat alone. Compressing our services that are currently being provided in 500 megahertz into 200 megahertz is going to require us alone to launch 7 more satellites, to do a lot of traffic grooming, to invest in video compression equipment, to utilize the spectrum more efficiently, to invest in Earth stations and fitting them and seeding new orbital positions that previously were not used for distribution, and in investing in filters and deploying hundreds of thousands of filters to Earth stations around the country. So if we can just build up the slide, please. Yeah. So to clear it by December 2023, it's truly an immense job. And then if anything is to be done in South America, it has to be looked at in this lens. What does it take really to compress satellite signals and compress them into less spectrum to make it happen? If we go on to the next slide. So this kind of brings up the point about MNOs and this myth that 80 to 100 megahertz is needed for every MNO to make 5G work. There was a study that was done by Ofcom that basically concluded that the economic benefits of 5G can be achieved in the first 40 megahertz. Obviously, if you get more spectrum, it's better, but with 40 megahertz, you can achieve the economic benefits of 5G. So this notion that 80 to 100 megahertz is a must is truly, I think, an exaggeration. It's nice to have, but I don't think it's necessary. But even with that, if you assume that in every country there's about 3 to 4 MNOs, if we clear 300 megahertz, i.e., if we look at the 3.3 to 3.6 or 3.3 to 3.7, there's certainly pretty ample spectrum for 5G deployment without having to encroach on the satellite spectrum above 3.7. So there is already enough spectrum in the lower part without going over above 3.7, and we can even achieve the 80 to 100 megahertz statement that the mobile industry talks about. Next slide, please. So this is quite interesting because it comes from the mobile economy report of the GSMA that was issued last year. The key thing here that we notice is that in South America right now, in Latin America, less than 50% of all connections are 4G. So 4G is still very much in the running, and they expect that by 2025, only about 50% of all connections, which is the pink bars, by 2025, only 50% of the connections are going to be 4G. And we're not even talking about 5G. 5G is barely going to be taken off. So one wonders, is it truly a spectrum issue? I mean, is it throwing more spectrum here and giving more spectrum is going to close this gap, or is it a different issue? Is it an affordability issue? Is it a business case issue? So when we listen to the mobile industry and to mobile manufacturers, the solution to all problems, the cure to all ills, is to clear more spectrum. But when you look at the reality of deployment, in this case here, the mobile industry certainly have the spectrum. Why are they deploying? And probably there are other reasons other than spectrum, which is affordability, business case, and other issues. And the other point that I would like to highlight is which was brought up in the previous session, is the reliance on Wi-Fi. So again, before we take spectrum away from satellite and put it to MNO to mobile use, I think we need to look at all the avenues that are available. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, we can. So there is a risk also if we put too much spectrum in the hands of mobile. I mean, it's purely a supply and demand issue. If the extended C-band is already available in 3.4 to 3.7, or 3.3 to 3.7, and we put even more spectrum, this will only lead to inefficient use of spectrum. It will depress auction prices, and it will give spectrum to really unproven business cases at this point. So it's really something that regulators need to look out very carefully. You just go on to one more slide, please. What we learned from this is that the several lessons that we learned from the U.S. process and from other processes around the world is that one size doesn't really fit all. If certain regions, I mean, like what's happening in Europe, for example, they rely on C-band a lot less than they rely than in Latin America. So it's wouldn't be very wise to take cues from other regions that have a different usage profile. The U.S. also has a different usage profile from Latin America. So one size doesn't really fit all. We have to be careful before we make any hasty moves. The second point that we learned also is that recognition of the incumbent rights and the value of the services they provide is really key, because if that should be the starting point before we leap forward. That's really key, because this kind of leads us to the third point, which is that the satellite operators are really in the best position to clear spectrum if the decision is made to clear that spectrum, because they know the nature of the business, they know how manage their customers, and then if any transition is to take place, it should be with the involvement of the satellite operators. It cannot be taken by force. The spectrum cannot be taken by force. And lastly, industry collaboration is key. I think we have reached a maturity level on both sides where we are pragmatic and we know what needs to be done to achieve a win-win solution for all sides. And this was clearly proven in the FCC in the U.S. proceeding in C-band. The auction is going to be run in December, and we are on target to clear the first batch of spectrum by December 2021, and the remaining 300 the remaining part of the 300 megahertz by December 2023. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Haz. I'm thinking here about where we're setting the dial between mobile and satellite, and we've heard 3 different stories already of ways to achieve that, and how we actually enact that setting of the dial. Let's take our next speaker, who's Jose Ayala. I hope I got that right. Who's the spectrum chair for the CTEL region for the GSA. You'll no doubt tell us a little bit about what's happening with deployments in C-band. So Jose, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Hope you listen well. Next slide, please. In respect of all our colleagues from Latin America, I'll continue in Spanish moving forward. There's translation. Thank you. Bueno, se ha hablado mucho de 5G en esta conferencia, y en realidad 5G es acerca de transformación digital. En la visión de la GSA, 5G impulsará nuevos modelos de negocio con aplicaciones innovadoras más allá de las comunicaciones de banda ancha móvil a alta velocidad. Estamos hablando de múltiples industrias que se van a transformar, pero uno de los grandes pilares de 5G para impulsar esta transformación digital es la baja latencia en tiempo real. Eso es clave para muchos servicios que se van a combinar también con realidad aumentada, realidad virtual, tal como manufactura 4.0, accesos fijos inalámbricos a todo tipo de empresas y hogares, telemedicina, conexiones de transportes V2X, drones, ciudades inteligentes y muchas otras. Adicionalmente, 5G para América Latina representa una gran oportunidad para impulsar la recuperación económica en la era de post-COVID, generando inversiones directas, empleos directos, indirectos y mucha productividad y eficiencia de sus industrias. Vemos reportes de hoy de la Bolsa de Valores que después de las reelecciones en Estados Unidos, se está recuperando la confianza de todos los inversionistas hacia los mercados emergentes. Y América Latina puede ser el foco de estas inversiones si tienen la infraestructura adecuada. Next slide, please. En la visión de nuestra asociación, 5G también, a la vez que va a impulsar nuevas aplicaciones, va a generar nuevas demandas para conectar todo en todas partes, y el espectro será vital. Recomendamos que se libere espectro en bandas bajas, medias y altas para ofrecer una experiencia de servicio completa de 5G a todo tipo de usuarios e industrias. En este aspecto, la banda C es clave porque ofrece un balance óptimo entre cobertura y capacidad, lo cual será vital para proporcionar una experiencia de servicio adecuada en áreas amplias, ciudades, zonas urbanas y suburbanas. Se cuestiona, he escuchado a la vez de la conferencia de otros sectores, que para qué tanto espectro. Y en realidad, lo que se ha visto en los primeros lanzamientos comerciales de 5G en Corea es un aumento de 3 veces en solo 6 meses del tráfico de datos de 5G comparado con 4G. Por usuario estamos hablando de 25 gigabytes por mes. Ese es un tráfico que ha explotado debido a la aplicación de realidad aumentada, realidad virtual. Uno de nuestros miembros, Ericsson, miembro de la GSA, estima que el tráfico de 5G va a representar 45% del tráfico de datos total móvil para el año 2025. En general, pues la banda también C va a permitir a los operadores poder lograr cumplir con los objetivos del estándar IMT 2020 de proveer 100 megabits como mínimo por segundo a los usuarios en cualquier tipo de entorno, urbano, suburbano, interiores. Next slide, please. La banda C ya tiene mucho despliegue a nivel mundial. Es una banda que ha sido el foco de las inversiones, perdón, de los operadores. A octubre de este año existen 188 operadores que están invirtiendo en el rango de 3.300 a 4.200. Perdón, 90 de estos operadores están desplegando sus redes en las bandas N77, que es el rango 3.3 a 4.200 MHz, y la banda 78, que es 3.3 a 3.800. Vemos acá en este slide que hay muchos países en color rojo. Es decir, 5G en la banda C ya es una realidad y el tiempo de actuar es hoy. No es una pregunta sí o cuándo, ya está sucediendo. Next slide, please. En la región 2, la GSA celebra pues que las administraciones de la CITEL apoyaron la resolución 245 en la pasada CMR19 y que ahora pues tenemos el punto de agenda 1.2 hacia la CMR23 y ofrece una gran oportunidad para armonizar la banda C en el rango de 3.3 hasta 3.8. Actualmente, en la región 2, el rango de 3.300, 3.400 ya fue identificado para IMT por 13 países. 3.400, 3.600 ya fue identificado en toda la región 2 desde la CMR 15. 3.600, 3.700 ya fue identificado por 8 países en la pasada CMR 19 y 3.700, 3.800 ha sido identificado al menos por un país. Por lo tanto, aquí hay una gran oportunidad de armonización para toda la región y se invita a las administraciones a que continúen impulsando los estudios en la Conferencia Mundial del 2023 que ahora se están llevando en el grupo de trabajo 5D de la OIT. Next slide, please. Rápidamente, todo este desarrollo está siendo impulsado por un vigoroso ecosistema de terminales. A septiembre de este año existían 440 dispositivos de 5G anunciados. De estos, más de la mitad, 235, están siendo ofrecidos en la banda de N78 y N77. Y hay de este grupo de 235 dispositivos, 146 son teléfonos inteligentes y 31 son terminales fijos de uso comercial y también industrial. Next slide, please. Finalizando, celebramos que tenemos el apoyo de muchas administraciones en la región 2. Existen en todos los países, desde Estados Unidos, Canadá, Brasil, Chile y otros que ya están en proceso de asignar este espectro que es importante para brindar una experiencia de servicio completa de 5G a los consumidores. Nuestras recomendaciones a las administraciones es, número 1, continuar apoyando los estudios de coexistencia en el punto de orden 1.2 de la Conferencia Mundial del 2023, que incluye estos importantes rangos, 3.300, 3.400 y 3.600, 3.800. Apoyar la asignación del espectro, porque esto ya es una realidad, como le hemos mostrado acá, no es ni cuándo, el tiempo de actuar es hoy, donde ya se está impulsando un vigoroso ecosistema a nivel mundial. Considerar diferentes mecanismos para acelerar la asignación del espectro en banda C, que es vital. El número 1 es subastas y concursos de belleza, que es el típico en la región. Otros que han usado otros países es la autorización que permite a los concesionarios existentes que ya tienen espectro para uso de WiMAX o Fixed Wireless Access, que puedan brindar servicios 5G. Perú ha hecho esto recientemente. Y tercero, el mercado de uso de espectro secundario, que se ha utilizado en varios países alrededor del mundo y permite que un operador móvil pueda adquirir espectro para lanzar quinta generación. En algunos países las concesiones son a pequeños ISPs o proveedores de Internet que no tienen la escala ni el volumen de inversión, el músculo de inversión. Por lo tanto, acá se trata de liberar el espectro a la mayor velocidad posible. El espectro ocioso es el más costoso para la sociedad. Y el tercer recomendación es asignar el espectro de banda C buscando maximizar el beneficio social sobre los ingresos fiscales. Es decir, se debe reducir el costo del espectro y las cargas fiscales para aumentar o fomentar las inversiones en infraestructura de redes, que ha sido el éxito que ha tenido países en Asia como China, Corea, Japón, incluso Estados Unidos, que han puesto como objetivo maximizar el beneficio social sobre los objetivos de recaudación fiscal. Con esto, pues, les agradezco mucho la atención y estoy disponible para consultas.
Thank you, Jose. Interesting. And there's a couple of points you make there concerning getting that spectrum into use and making sure that it's available to those who can put it to good use. Again, a topic I think we shall probably come back to. Just to say, if you haven't already taken part, there are polls available for you to respond to. And if you respond to those polls, we'll look at the results and maybe that will spark some questions that we can ask the panelists. So if you haven't done that, click on the polls. You'll see them on the website, and then you can respond to the questions there. So that just leaves us with one more speaker, and it's definitely not the last is the least. It's Diana Morales, who's the subdirector of ANE in Colombia. Good afternoon, good morning, Diana, and very good to have you with us. Please provide us with your presentation.
Muchísimas gracias y buenas tardes. ¿Podríamos compartir la presentación, por favor? Listo. Siguiente, next slide, por favor. Bueno, en la misma línea que lo decíamos ayer hace un momento, en Colombia hemos estado monitoreando el uso de la banda de 3.5 GHz a nivel mundial para las IMT. Y se ha venido observando un creciente número de administraciones que están reconociendo la sobresaliente capacidad de la banda de 3.5 GHz para el despliegue de las redes de 3.5. Como resultado de este interés en esta banda, la mayoría de las administraciones en los diferentes países, en las diferentes regiones, se están esforzando por asignar al menos 200 o 400 MHz de espectro continuo. No sabemos la importancia que tiene la banda de 3.5 GHz gracias a la cobertura y la capacidad, pues que son características específicas de esta banda y es de las pocas bandas que quedan ya debajo de 6 gigas. La Agencia Nacional del Espectro, pues al igual que muchas administraciones de otros países, también está buscando asegurar los beneficios de 5G para Colombia a través de poder contar con procesos de asignación de la banda de 3.5 GHz de manera continua para los operadores móviles y con el fin de poder lograr la visión de un futuro de las IMT en el país. Y también lo que se busca es conectar a millones de dispositivos y proporcionar banda ancha. Next slide, please. Bueno, ¿cuáles son los planes de banda que tenemos en Colombia? Bueno, en Colombia tenemos una particularidad y es que desde el 2015 la banda de 3.5 GHz, exactamente en el rango de 3.3 a 3.7, fue identificada para las IMT. Esto ha hecho que desde el 2015 se haya empezado una limpieza de la banda y en este momento esa banda está completamente limpia para adelantar un proceso de asignación. El Ministerio de TIC de Colombia ya anunció que para el próximo año, en el segundo semestre, va a adelantar ese proceso de asignación de la banda. Se está pues, teniendo en cuenta también la recomendación de la UITR, la recomendación 11036-6. Lo que se está buscando es un plan de banda TDD. Como ustedes ven en la gráfica, en este momento en la diapositiva, pues la UITR recomienda TDD en la porción de 3.436 y de 3.410 a 3.590 también para el uso de 4G, porque recordemos que en algunos países también se ha desarrollado 4G sobre esta banda, pues recomienda FDD. En Colombia, lo que estamos teniendo en cuenta en este momento es un plan de banda de TDD desde la 3.300 a 3.700. Con esto podemos asegurar bloques continuos pues, de 80 a 100 MHz en esta banda. Next slide, please. ¿En qué hemos avanzado en Colombia frente a la banda de 3.500? Como les indicaba, esta banda pues ya se encuentra completamente limpia para asignación. Entonces, lo que se hizo durante el año pasado fue adelantar un estudio de coexistencia, porque en la banda contigua, en la banda de 3.700, funcionan los servicios fijos móviles, en Colombia los servicios fijos móviles satelitales. Esos servicios están a partir de 3.700. Entonces, era muy importante identificar para ese proceso de asignación cuáles eran las condiciones técnicas que se debían conservar dentro, pues en la coexistencia entre los servicios móviles y los servicios satelitales. En el estudio, pues hicieron varios escenarios en laboratorio en los cuales se identificó la interferencia que puede generar un nodo B a una estación terrena y una estación terrena a un nodo B. Esto se hizo para ambientes rurales y también para ambientes urbanos. ¿Qué fue lo que se logró encontrar con este estudio? Que al tener unas bandas de guarda entre 21 a 26 MHz, lo que se debía tener en cuenta era la inclinación de cada una de las antenas para poder definir la distancia que debe haber entre las estaciones terrenas satelitales y entre las estaciones terrenales de IMT en el momento que se realice la asignación de la banda de 3.7. Next slide, please. Bueno, adicionalmente, pues como lo indicaba, en Colombia tenemos en este momento de la banda de 3.3 a 3.7, tenemos la banda completamente libre y se están empezando a hacer estudios frente a la banda de 3.7 hasta la banda de 4.2, en la cual actualmente funcionan los servicios fijos satelitales. En el monitoreo que se ha adelantado por parte de la banda, pues esta banda de 3.7 a 4.2 están los servicios satelitales, pero actualmente también en la banda de 3.3 a 3.7, dado que en Colombia en este año se están adelantando pruebas para el servicio 5G, tenemos permisos temporales, pues que están asignados por 6 meses inicialmente para las pruebas que están haciendo los operadores móviles en esta banda de 3.5 GHz. La decisión pues debe estar frente a los servicios incumbentes, lo que es la decisión que tienen que tomar los diferentes países, porque pues como todos sabemos, en esta banda en diferentes países se está prestando el servicio móvil satelital, también se está prestando el servicio de radiolocalización. Por lo tanto, cada una de las administraciones lo que debemos entrar a considerar es la necesidad del despliegue de IMT o también la necesidad de conservar esa coexistencia entre los diferentes servicios en el país. Por el momento, esto es todo lo que tenía para contarles y quedo atenta a las preguntas que tengan. Gracias.
Thank you, Diana. Really interesting to hear what's been happening in Colombia and some of the work you've been doing on that. I see we have all our panelists back with us, and while we put the poll results together, we have a question that's come in from the floor, which is that our discussion about C-band so far has been primarily about the downlink band, the band where we receive Earth stations. And there is another part of the C-band, of course, which is the uplink band, around about 6 gigahertz. Now, I know there was a session on the 6 gigahertz band this morning, but maybe each of the panelists could spend a minute and just say how they, what they're thinking about that, the uplink part of the C-band. I have a number of faces in front of me. Let's go around in a circle, starting top left. Diana, first of all to you, what's your view on the uplink part, the 6 gigahertz part of the C-band?
Ok, sí, muchas gracias. En Colombia también se está empezando a estudiar el tema. Este año vamos a publicar una consulta porque queremos conocer cuál es el interés que tienen tanto los operadores móviles como también el interés que tiene la industria para poder hacer un uso libre de una porción de la banda de 6 GHz. Entonces, como les digo, estamos empezando, como también otras muchas regiones. Ya sabemos que en Perú se acaba también de publicar una consulta. Chile también ya tomó algunas decisiones frente a esa banda de 6 gigas para empezar a estudiar el tema.
Great. Okay. Interesting. Diana, how's the situation in Canada? Sorry, not Diana, Rima. How's the situation in Canada?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so as you may know, the US has looked to opening the spectrum up as well. So we, in Canada, closely monitor the developments across the border. And we have identified looking at this as a priority in our spectrum outlook. So it's certainly something that, you know, we are looking to consult on in the near future.
Okay, interesting. And Has, what's your view? I mean, the questioner specifically was questioning whether you were proposing that as an alternative maybe to the downlink band, that the uplink band might be a consideration.
Well, it's interesting because we see so many directions, even from within the terrestrial mobile industry from both sides. We see the Wi-Fi, some companies are pushing for Wi-Fi for unlicensed, and some other major manufacturers are pushing for a mobile license approach. So our primary interest here is to protect the satellite uplinks from whatever use it is. So we're somewhat agnostic at this point to whether it's licensed or unlicensed, for as long as they limit their emissions toward the satellites, because we think that aggregate interference from a massive number of devices can actually interfere with satellites at some point, and it's going to be such a slow decay that you cannot attribute it to a single culprit. You're going to reach a point where it's too late, and at that point you can't reverse it, because it has become it has metastasized to a high level.
So I guess an interesting point there is the fact that if you can't have a decision taken by each country individually in the way that it's been done for the downlink band, because from what you're saying, if, for example, Colombia decided to use the uplink band and caused a high aggregate level of interference, then that would rule out anybody else using it at the same time, because one more station would tip the balance. So it has to be a very global solution.
It's what we have seen, for example, in the FCC order, there was very little language used about protection of satellites. There was some language about limiting emissions above certain elevation angle, but it was the aggregate interference issue was dismissed. But like I said, I think it will build up over time, and at some point it becomes you can't attribute the interference to a specific user.
Okay, let's move on to Jose. Jose, do you have any thoughts on use of the uplink part of the C-band?
Yes, GSA is supporting the studies towards WRC, which are for region 1 in this case, to understand the possibilities that we have in the uplink part of the C-band. So as the moment, that's the position. Thank you.
A watching brief. And finally, Chris, the UK, Europe, I guess, the agenda item being region 1 specific, maybe there's been more thought about it.
Yeah, so we need to divide the band into 2 parts. So in the UK, we've a few months ago in July took a decision to make the 59256425 megahertz band available for Wi-Fi. So that's been done. So that's now available. And actually next week, I'll be chairing a meeting in Europe where we will look at the European approach to that. And I think it's quite likely that Europe would also agree to make that 5964 band available for Wi-Fi. on that same basis. Then there's a separate issue about the spectrum above 6.4, 7.1, which is the band that's being looked at in the WRC. And at this stage, we don't have a clear view on exactly which way that will go, other than it's going to be looked at as part of the process under the European preparations for Agenda Item 1.2.
So the UK being the first to make a noise in the uplink band and annoy Hazard's aggregate limits. Lovely. Well, look, we've had a couple of poll questions and we've had the responses to them, and maybe that will spark some thought. The two questions we asked were, in those countries where C-band is still needed for satellite services, and actually, I think all of you have said that, certainly from the regulatory perspective, that you will leave some of the band for C-band. You will leave, I mean, it might be 100 megahertz, might be 200 megahertz, might be 400, 500, but everybody in their band plan did leave spectrum in C-band for satellite services. So one of the questions is, how much longer will that C-band spectrum be necessary? And look at the results here. The overwhelming majority, well, 42% isn't really overwhelming, but nonetheless, it's the largest number, said that it would continue to be needed for more than 10 years. So I have a question, and in fact, if Rima, I could start with you. The plans that you proposed looked at leaving 100 or 200 megahertz of C-band, depending how, and some shared spectrum as well. What is it that's so important in C-band that you want to leave some of it and not just clear all of it?
Well, you talked about some of the advantages in rain, and that's certainly something this band offers, propagation characteristics that are, very important. So the thing about Canada is we have a very wide geography. A lot of our population is condensed into urban areas, but then, the rest of the country, there is population still there, albeit sparse. But it's really important for us to serve those rural areas. So, that's the main driver behind keeping 200 megahertz, allowing satellite services, and even in the other 300 megahertz, looking at solutions, some sharing solutions that can actually, in satellite dependent areas, have services still continue where they're really critical for Canadians. So it's a really important aspect. And for us, there's a lot of technical work to be ironed out in terms of how the two services can coexist in certain areas and in certain spectrum, as well as, the transitioning process, which is another, in and of itself, another issue that we were working out. So for us, it's really, you asked the question whether it's technical or political, all kinds of questions around it, but it really, for us, it's a combination, and it boils down to recognizing the importance of both services in Canada for us.
Interesting. And noting as well, on that map, Canada isn't somewhere with heavy rainfall, but I guess you have heavy snowfall in parts of the country, which would make up for that, which tends to sit on the dish for long periods. Haz, let me come to you next, if I could. What we've seen is a squeeze on spectrum, and I think you made the point that, if you have too much spectrum, that doesn't really do you any good. But at the same point, if you don't have enough, then that makes you unhappy. And with all the refarming taking place within C-band, moving all the services into a much smaller piece of spectrum, is that enough that you're happy, or is that now getting to the point where you feel that not having enough will start to make you unhappy?
Well, I think in the US, what is left right now is barely enough to basically to make it happen. And you can see that in order to make it happen, we are going to launch 7 satellites. Our partners in the SCS probably going to launch a similar number. So imagine around 13 satellites are going to be launched just to make the difference, to make this to overcome the shortage that's going to be created. So what I get out of it is that it's important to look at regional and sub-regional harmonization, because of the because the US and Canada rely on the same C-band ecosystem, right? So if the US moved in one direction, then it makes sense for Canada to follow the same line, because it's the same ecosystem. Essentially, you have spectrum that's being cleared in the US. So, and if you're relying on the same satellites, you might as well kind of integrate that and take advantage of it. So it makes sense that both sides are in lockstep to the extent possible, right? But when you look at South America, right, it's a different video distribution ecosystem. You have an economic area that speaks Spanish. They rely on media distribution on linear TV in a big way. If you start to have this variation where you have different countries moving at different speeds, where some country stops at 3.8 and some country stops at 3.7 and some countries stop at 3.6, you essentially going to have to distill it to the least common denominator. That means that this part of the spectrum where there's differences in allocation becomes really unusable, because when you are sending a video signal, when you are sending a football game to all of South America, and then you have some countries you can't use the bottom part of the spectrum, that's sort of completely, you can't have things moving at different speeds. So harmonizations within the sub-regional group is important, but it has to be done with the recognition of what services you have, and can you really squeeze them into lesser spectrum, So if it took us 7 satellites to compress the US and the Canadian ecosystem, what is it going to take us to do the same in South America? And who's going to pay for it, and how it's going to move? So a lot of questions.
That's a good question, and I guess that brings us on to Diana, as somebody who's at the other end of that ecosystem, and whose country relies heavily on watching video on C-band. Diana, you've proposed a plan for us for how Colombia is going to divide the C-band between 5G and IMT. And you also very kindly provided a chart which showed what was happening in some of the other countries in the region. And it's not the same. How did you in Colombia come to a decision about how much of this C-band spectrum should be for mobile, and how much of it do you need to maintain for satellite?
En Colombia, pues como les indicaba, la banda de 3.3 a 3.7 ya está identificada para IMT, pero el proceso de asignación de espectro se va a realizar hasta el próximo año, con lo cual ahí también veremos cuál es el interés de los operadores móviles en la asignación de este espectro. Y por el momento también de 3.7 a 4.2 en este momento se están prestando los servicios fijos satelitales. Entonces, una vez también se realice la subasta de espectro, tendremos que hacer una revisión primero de cuál fue el interés que tuvieron los operadores móviles de ese espectro. Finalmente también si hay posibilidad de, en esta banda de 3.7 a 4.2, pensar en unas asignaciones IMT, no sé, tal vez regionales o locales, dependiendo también de la ubicación de las estaciones terrenas, para aprovechar aquellos sitios donde se podría prestar el servicio y podrían coexistir ambos servicios. Pero pues vuelvo a insistir, todo depende también de la subasta que se pueda adelantar el próximo año para mirar el interés de los operadores.
So it's still an open question, which is interesting. I'm going to go over to Chris, because I know that the UK, Chris, you already presented the fact that to some extent, a decision has been made in the sense that the whole of the C-band will be available to different users, including all the way up to 4.2 for shared usage. Does that mean that the UK has taken a decision that it doesn't need to protect any of the C-band services that are in that band?
That's definitely not how I would characterize it. I mean, I think the decision in the UK and the first across Europe is that, and this was taken probably a decade ago, was 3.4 to 3.8 is essentially being cleared for mobile. From 3.8 to 4.2, we continue to anticipate having the incumbent users continue to use that band. So that's both fixed links and satellite users. And there's no intention to inhibit the development of those services, and we think 3.8 to 4.2 is a really good place for those services to continue to flourish. The point I think that though is increasingly important here is that doesn't mean there's not opportunity to use the spectrum more efficiently. And that's something we have to look at from a regulatory perspective, just due to the increasing demands on spectrum. And I think this works, across the piece. We think there is opportunity in that 3.8 to 4.2 to look at how you might put local licenses in there. And this is things like industry verticals. These would be low power type applications to cover relatively small local areas, for example. And that wouldn't interfere with those incumbent users. Equally, I mean, I perhaps a bit clumsy earlier, but I said, we're clearing 3.4 to 3.8. I mean, that spectrum is essentially being cleared, but there may be some Earth stations that will continue to operate actually in part of that band. And the simple reason being that, although the spectrum is being made available for mobile, that doesn't mean that 100% of the geographic area of the UK is going to be covered by mobile in 3.4 to 3.8. Indeed, actually, we know, just use the propagation characteristics, it's actually going to be focused around cities. So if you've got an Earth station in a rural area, you may well continue to be able to operate it. It will just not be protected going forward. So I think we've just got to look at our options and think sensibly about how we can actually use that spectrum most effectively. And I think opportunities for sharing, and sometimes it doesn't have to be particularly sophisticated sharing. We're not talking advanced databases here, will actually allow us to do that and use it more efficiently.
Mm-hmm. If I just may comment on Chris, I think what Chris said is precisely highlights how certain countries need to look sometimes at their own conditions. I mean, C-band use for FSS in the UK is quite limited to Earth stations. So it's certainly, we cannot argue with a straight face that you must preserve C-band across the entire band in the UK for FSS, because we know that the nature of use in the UK is quite limited. So that makes sense. But this is also at the same time precisely why countries sometimes or regions should not copy each other blindly without looking at the details. What the UK can do is possibly undoable in South America, right? And this notion of that we must harmonize at any cost. I think you harmonize to a point where it makes sense, but then beyond that, you need to look at your own situation, and at that point, it becomes the economies of scale. I mean, are enough people crossing that line and doing it and making it worthwhile or not? So it's just, I think it's an important point.
Let's give Jose a quick chance. We've got about 10 minutes left. We started the session a little bit late, so we're going to take the liberty of finishing.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Jose, what's the mobile
I'll
operator?
continue.
Do you want the whole of the band, or are you happy to share with the satellites?
Yes, thank you. So I apologize. I will continue in Spanish because of our region and audience. Bueno, he escuchado con atención muchos comentarios. ¿Cuánto tiempo se va a necesitar la banda C downlink para satélites? Estamos viviendo una revolución completa en convergencia y es una pregunta excelente que las administraciones tienen que plantearse. Vemos que el contenido de video es el que predomina en esta banda sobre los servicios satelitales, pero a la vez hay avances en la tecnología de compresión y se necesita mucho menos capacidad en los satélites. Y por otra parte, la latencia de medio segundo en el satélite, de round trip, aproximadamente, pues realmente es una experiencia de usuario que es pobre, y estamos viendo que la televisión lineal está siendo migrada, la audiencia, hacia los contenidos en línea. Netflix está muy popular, banda ancha. Sin embargo, juegan un papel importante y es una pregunta que se tiene que plantear las administraciones. ¿Cuánto uso se está haciendo de este espectro que es valioso y cuál es el beneficio social que se tiene del espectro? Ahora, alguien había consultado antes de si los canales de 40 MHz eran suficientes para servicios de móviles. Y como lo comenté anteriormente, la experiencia en Corea, para mencionar un ejemplo únicamente, es que en los primeros 6 meses de lanzamiento de los servicios de quinta generación, el tráfico de datos ha aumentado 3 veces. Bueno, más de 3 veces. 5G es aproximadamente 3 veces el tráfico de 4G en Corea. Y eso apenas en 6 meses. Se está viendo mucho consumo de video, pero ya más avanzado, con realidad aumentada, realidad virtual. En los CPEs que tenemos nosotros en la base de datos de GSA, o los dispositivos, estamos viendo que esta es una categoría que ya está muy activa. Le llaman pantallas en la cara, son anteojos. Y hay mucho de esta aplicación para manufactura 4.0, perdón, aplicaciones industriales y muchas otras. Entonces, en resumen, 40 MHz no son suficientes hoy día, ni van a ser suficientes menos en el tiempo. Lo que nosotros recomendamos son por lo menos 100 MHz de espectro para iniciar con una visión más grande de por lo menos 200 MHz. Para dar un ejemplo, una de nuestras empresas es Ericsson, para la cual yo trabajo, y hemos hecho demostraciones, están en YouTube las pruebas, y en la banda de 3.5 con 100 MHz de espectro se pueden lograr velocidades de 5.4 gigabits por segundo en la descarga. Eso es experiencia de usuario y son en ambientes urbanos. Por lo tanto, lo que vemos nosotros es que va a haber una explosión de tráfico. Estimamos que el tráfico de 5G va a ser casi la mitad del tráfico total de datos móviles para el 2025. Y ya bien adelantada esta década, en la segunda mitad, vamos a necesitar mucho más tráfico. Por lo tanto, los canales de 40 MHz, aunque son una salida para muchas administraciones en tiempo corto, realmente van a ser muy poca capacidad en el largo plazo. Creemos que hay muchas formas de coexistencia con los servicios incumbentes, ya están documentadas. La CMR23 va a profundizar más en estos estudios y han habido avances significativos de los estudios antiguos de 4G, que se hicieron con tecnologías de 4G hace años, a la tecnología que tenemos con 5G hoy día, con beamforming, massive MIMO y controles de potencia. Incluso 5G va a requerir menos potencia de la transmisión de cuarta generación. Por lo tanto, hay bastante esperanza que estos estudios van a dar resultados muy positivos y que se va a poder tener una armonización de un rango de espectro que es clave para dar una experiencia completa del servicio 5G a todos los consumidores. Pues agradezco la oportunidad, Richard, y los colegas panelistas que han estado excelentes. Gracias.
Thank you, Jose. That brings us perfectly onto the second of our poll questions, because you say, okay, 5G will provide us with the bandwidth we want to do the video and other things that we want. So one of the questions we asked is, okay, if we no longer had C-band satellite, what would we replace it with? And by far the greatest seems to be satellite in other bands. So I guess, Haz, that will keep you happy, even if it's not in the C-band itself. Interestingly, if we add together satellite and there are no substitutes, that is then an overwhelming majority of people with that opinion. Unfortunately for Jose, only 19% think that actually 5G will be the thing that replaces C-band satellites. A very mixed bag of results. We have about 3 minutes left. So I just want to give everybody an opportunity to, one sentence that sums up the battle here we have. We had that dial, we set it all the way towards satellite, or we could set it all the way towards mobile. And it's clear that even Haz, from the satellite operators, recognizes it's not going to be all the way towards satellite. Mm-hmm. So last sentence, last thoughts, very quickly, because we don't want to keep everybody waiting too long. And I'll go around, starting with you, Diana. Where should we set the dial? And where should we set it in 5 years? Will it be different? Diana?
Sí, perdón, si no te había escuchado. No, el día tiene que estar en la mitad. Finalmente, el servicio tanto IMT como satelital es muy importante. En países como Colombia, por la geografía que tenemos, hay sitios donde el servicio satelital es de gran importancia. Y pues, la capacidad de las redes IMT también para otros sitios de mayor concentración también es de gran importancia. Entonces, yo dejo el dial en la mitad.
Very good answer. Very diplomatic. Rima, what about Canada? It looks like you've already set your dial very heavily towards mobile.
I wouldn't say that. I would say that, again, the importance, both services are important to us, and we put forward a consultation paper that tries to enable flexible use as well as preserve satellite use that is critical to so many Canadians. So again, for us, it's a balance. I'm not sure if, I can assign a percentage to it. I'd prefer not to, especially since our consultations is still ongoing. I'm definitely curious, though, on the previous poll in terms of, the more than 10 years, 42%. I assume HAS is in that more than 10 years camp since they're launching 7 new satellites. But I would like to know, I think beyond 10 years, the vision for C-band satellite, maybe 20, 30 years. I'm curious about that. Thanks.
20 or 30 years, I think most of us will have retired and we won't be worrying about C-band. Certainly I will be. Chris, I guess you're in the same boat. But what's your view on where that dial should be set?
So, two quick comments. I mean, firstly, I think it will depend upon where you are in the world. I mean, I think that there are areas of the world that are going to be more reliant on C-band satellite, particularly for rain fade effect, et cetera, than others. And the second point is that I think actually we should recharacterize the question a little bit, which is that it shouldn't be a battle between the two. And I really do think that going forward, we have to find a more constructive way of actually getting different services to coexist wherever possible. So I'm not sure it's as simple as just putting a number on a dial. I do think we'll be debating this for some time, and probably until long after I retire.
Jose, a last minute or a last sentence from you.
Sentence very quickly. I'll wrap up in English this time. Mobile industry right now has closed the connectivity for over 7 billion people all over the world. We need the C-band in order to connect the next 100 billion devices and make the 5G experience best for everybody. Thank you.
And finally, the last word has. Quickly, if you can.
I think I would summarize it. Let me just. I would summarize it by saying it should be. Hold on, I'm just on mute. So I think we need to be realistic and not be exuberant. I mean, I'll go back to the point about how much spectrum is needed. There is plenty of spectrum in the 3.3 to 3.7 to give every MNO in every country the 100 megahertz that Jose talked about. So there's no need to go above 3.7 if you have 400 megahertz down below. So I think we need to think about realistic objectives. And the other point is that, again, if this is the case, if this C-band is extremely important, how come 4G is still at 50% penetration in South America with the existing spectrum? If we are at that, then why do we still need to dump more than additional spectrum in a situation where we still haven't achieved ideal penetration in 4G? So that's how I would end it.
Okay, well, I'd love to be able to take that up with the others and see what their views were, but unfortunately we're very much out of time. Thank you to all the panelists for a very, very interesting session. And I think, as Chris said, this is something we'll still be debating, maybe in 10, maybe in even 20 years, who knows?
Richard, thank you so much, and add my thanks to Richard, to all of the panelists as well. Another fascinating discussion, and echo that. I'm sure it's a discussion that is going to go on, and could have gone on for a long time here, but we do have to wrap that up now. So thank you all so much for that. So that's the end of our discussions on this main stage here today. But it's not the end at all. So it's now your opportunity out there, all of you out there, it's your opportunity to get involved. So we're now moving to our Have Your Say session. So you can click on the Sessions tab in the left-hand menu bar on your screen. Click on that tab. then click into the Have Your Say room. You can then go into there and you can request to bring your audio and your video feed live, and you can come and be part of the discussion. You can give your thoughts, your comments on the discussions that happened here in this session just now, the 6 gigahertz session earlier, or any of the sessions over the last few days. So please do come and join us in there now. I'll be making my way over there. So we'll see you in the Have Your Say session. And a quick reminder that we're starting again at 9 o'clock Bogota tomorrow morning. The session's moving on to millimeter wave and also to UHF band, so to the higher and to the lower frequencies. But for now, thank you again to Richard and our panelists, and I will see you over in the Have Your Say room very shortly. Thanks, everyone.